April 17th, 2025, 4:47 in the morning. The frozen gray fields outside Pokrovsk, eastern Ukraine. Senior Lieutenant Dmytro Kovalenko pressed his eye against the optical feed of his reconnaissance drone, his breath fogging in the pre-dawn cold of a plywood command shelter barely large enough for 3 men. On his screen, half a kilometer across the gray zone, something was moving. Dozens of small silhouettes, then more, then dozens more, bobbing, weaving, clustering in the darkness like insects swarming from a cracked hive. He keyed his radio, his voice flat with genuine disbelief. "Command, this is Falcon 3. You are not going to believe what I'm looking at." He was looking at 150 motorcycles, not armored vehicles, not infantry fighting machines, not tanks, motorcycles. Chinese-made Enduros barely larger than the ones you'd find collecting dust in a suburban garage. Men in full combat kit, AK-74s slung across their chests, perched two to a bike on $1,500 Chinese machines built for trail riding. 150 of them, engines growling in the dark, revving for an assault across open terrain, directly into the most drone-saturated kill zone on the planet. In the command shelter, someone laughed. It came out nervous and short, the kind of laugh that isn't really a laugh at all. "They're sending us bicycles," a Ukrainian artillery officer muttered over the net. "They've run out of everything else, so now they're sending us bicycles." Nobody in that shelter understood, not yet, what they were actually watching. They thought they were witnessing desperation. The final absurdity of a military machine grinding itself to dust. What they were actually watching was the opening act of a tactical revolution that would change the shape of this war. If you've never subscribed to this channel, now is the time. Hit that subscribe button right now, because the story you're about to hear is one that the mainstream news has barely scratched the surface of. This is the full story of Russia's motorcycle assault doctrine. Where it came from, why it terrifies the people fighting it, and why the numbers behind it should alarm every military analyst on Earth. The image was almost comical, and the Ukrainians weren't alone in thinking so. When footage of Russian troops riding Chinese dirt bikes toward Ukrainian trenches first emerged in early 2024, military analysts across NATO literally chuckled. Think tanks wrote dismissive paragraphs. Social media exploded with memes comparing the Russian army to a Taliban convoy from 20 years ago. The BBC ran footage with captions describing it as evidence of Russian equipment shortfalls. Commentators who had spent careers analyzing mechanized warfare pointed at the bikes and called it a sign of systemic collapse. They weren't entirely wrong about the shortage part. Russia had burned through staggering numbers of armored vehicles since February 2022. Estimates by mid-2024 placed Russian tank losses above 4,000 vehicles. Infantry fighting vehicles, APCs, self-propelled guns, all being swallowed by a front that consumed machinery like a furnace. By late 2023, Russian President Vladimir Putin was personally inspecting Chinese-made all-terrain vehicles being procured for frontline use. At that point, only around 500 were in service. The Ministry of Defense immediately ordered 1,500 more. But here is what the analysts laughing at the footage missed entirely. Russia wasn't sending motorcycles because it had nothing else. Russia was sending motorcycles because it had discovered something that 3 years of the most drone-saturated warfare in human history had made blindingly obvious. The drone had killed the armored column. According to research published by the Royal United Services Institute, drones were responsible for 60 to 70% of all damaged or destroyed Russian military systems on the Ukrainian front. 60 to 70%. An armored personnel carrier in open ground was no longer a weapon of maneuver. It was a target. A slowly moving, easily spotted, explosively satisfying target for the swarms of Ukrainian FPV kamikaze drones that had turned the gray zone between the front lines into a graveyard of steel. A BMP full of infantry was not a tactical asset. It was a coffin on treads. But a motorcycle? A motorcycle presented a fundamentally different equation. It moved at up to 100 kilometers per hour across open terrain. It was small, low, difficult to track. It carried 2 men, which meant destroying one motorcycle cost the same drone sortie as destroying a vehicle that might otherwise carry 8. The math, brutal as it was, made a terrible kind of sense. And Russian field commanders, watching their armored formations evaporate under drone strikes in places like Avdiivka and Bakhmut, had started doing that math very seriously. Drop a comment right now and tell us where in the world you're watching this from. We've got viewers from across Europe, North America, and everywhere in between, and we want to hear from you. Comment below. Where are you watching? The architect of what would become Russia's formal motorcycle doctrine was Ground Forces Commander General Andrei Mordvichev. By late 2024, during the grinding pushes toward Pokrovsk in Donetsk Oblast, Mordvichev's units had begun integrating motorcycles not as a supplement to armored assaults, but as the lead element. The motorcycles would go first, fast, hard. Into the drone belt, the contested no-man's land corridor where Ukrainian FPV operators hunted everything that moved. The logic was brutal in its simplicity. Cross the kill zone before the kill zone can kill you. Russian instructions issued to motorcycle assault troops were clinical about the timelines. From the moment a reconnaissance drone detected movement, Ukrainian forces needed between 30 and 90 seconds to vector an FPV drone onto target. A motorcycle covering open ground at combat speed could cross 600 meters in that window. An armored vehicle covering the same distance took 3 to 4 minutes. The difference between 30 seconds and 4 minutes in a drone war was the difference between arriving and burning. The tactical doctrine that emerged from this thinking was codified into a 10-day intensive training program. Volunteer activist Roman Donik, reporting from Ukrainian intelligence sources, described the Russian exercises in April 2025. Troops practiced moving in small cells of 3 to 5 men, weaving and dispersing before surging into coordinated swarms of 30 to 50 motorcyclists. Units were trained to operate on frontages up to 600 meters wide with a planned depth of advance of 1.5 kilometers. The goal was to break through, hold positions for 3 to 4 days while awaiting reinforcement, and transition to perimeter defense before the next wave arrived. Each assault group had specific functional roles. There was a motorcyclist carrying portable electronic warfare equipment designed to jam incoming FPV drones, a motorcycle wrecker pulling a stretcher sled for wounded, a rider carrying mines, and a motorcycle chemist responsible for smoke deployment during the most exposed phases of the crossing. These were not improvised units making it up as they went. These were trained assault elements with a doctrine written specifically for the 21st century battlefield. The bikes themselves were almost entirely Chinese. The Russian domestic motorcycle industry, which had never advanced much beyond Cold War-era copies of pre-war German designs, was completely incapable of supplying what the front needed. So Russia bought Chinese, the BRZZ 7CB300F, Enduro, a lightweight 300 cubic centimeter machine with 25 horsepower and genuine off-road capability, became the vehicle most commonly seen in frontline footage. Some arrived from Chinese factories, already painted in military camouflage. The cheapest models cost the equivalent of around 1,500 euros. Russia, according to military procurement reporting, purchased over 40,000 of them in 2024 alone. By June 2025, the Russian Ministry of Defense had established dedicated motorcycle training facilities at the Novosibirsk Higher Military Command School, and a new training ground in Krasnodar Krai, with purpose-built tracks for motorcycles, ATVs, and quad bikes. Defense Minister Andrei Belousov had directly ordered Ground Forces Commander Mordvichev to equip these facilities as part of what Russian military media called modern tactics. Future procurement plans cited by multiple Russian military sources were staggering. 120,000 motorcycles, 30,000 ATVs, 12,000 buggies. Some sources cited targets as high as 200,000 light vehicles before the end of 2025. The Ukrainians were calling them banzai attacks, and for months, they were still laughing. The early results seemed to justify the mockery. Russian motorcycle units crashing through Ukrainian kill zones were massacred in appalling numbers. Drone footage showing columns of burning Chinese enduro bikes scattered across muddy fields circulated endlessly on social media. Ukrainian drone operators competed in their group chats over how many they could drop in a single pass. The kill ratio looked catastrophic for Russia. Hundreds of bikes destroyed, hundreds of men killed, ground gained, measured in meters. But something else was happening in those early encounters that Ukrainian intelligence was slow to process. Some of them were getting through. What time is it where you are right now? Drop the time in the comments. We've got people watching this at 3 in the morning and people watching over their morning coffee. Let us know. Senior Sergeant Alexei Voronov, a squad leader from the 39th Guards Motorized Rifle Brigade, described his unit's assault on a Ukrainian tree line position in the Donetsk sector in February 2025, in an interview later broadcast on Russian state media. His account was propaganda, obviously polished for the cameras, but the tactical detail underneath was real and it was chilling. "We crossed 800 meters in 40 seconds, Voronov said. "You don't think. You twist the throttle and you go. The drones come, but they cannot lock onto something moving that fast. When we hit the tree line, we dropped the bikes and went straight into the trench. The Ukrainians had 3 seconds of warning. 3 seconds. That's not enough time to do anything except panic." He paused and something crossed his face that wasn't performance. They hear the roar coming across the field, and they run. That's what happens. The sound alone makes them run. Ukrainian commander Andriy Ochanash confirmed the psychological dimension in a separate interview with CNN in April 2025. He acknowledged that the motorcycles were designed for a quick blitzkrieg, that they could advance very quickly and get behind the lines, and that losses on the Russian side were very high. But he also said something else, something important. The tactic was working, at least sometimes, at least enough to keep happening. The tactical pivot that changed everything occurred in the days surrounding April 17th, 2025, outside the village of Malinivka, near the critical Pokrovsk-Kostiantynivka highway. The 39th Motor Rifle Brigade had identified what field commanders described as a critical vulnerability, an exposed stretch of Ukrainian trench line lacking tree cover, and sitting on elevated, relatively dry ground in the improving spring weather. Russian reconnaissance had also noted that Ukrainian armored vehicles shuttling troops to the position were being regularly struck by drones along the main approach road. The position was manned. It was defended, but the supply line feeding it was being strangled from the air. Russian commanders made a decision. They would send in 150 motorcycle riders as the vanguard, using speed and dispersal to break through or around the Ukrainian forward drone screen. The bikes' narrow frames meant they could slip through gaps in the anti-tank minefield that would stop any wheeled or tracked vehicle cold. If even a third of them got through, they would overwhelm the forward Ukrainian positions, dismantle the dragon's teeth and barbed wire obstacles, and clear a corridor. Waiting behind them was a battalion of BMPs, 3 tanks, dozens of armored vehicles, all poised to surge forward the moment the motorcycle wave reported success. Ukrainian drone operator Kovalenko, watching on his screen in the plywood command shelter, had already forwarded the reconnaissance footage to headquarters when the first bikes started their run. The response was immediate. Within 90 seconds, the sky above the gray zone was saturated with Ukrainian FPV drones, vectored in from 3 separate operating positions. What followed was not a battle, it was an industrial process. The Ukrainian 14th Chervona-Kalina Brigade, supported by the 1st and 4th Regiments of the National Guard, had turned the approach corridor into a precisely mapped kill zone. Anti-tank ditches forced any assault into a predictable bottleneck. Dragoons' teeth and barbed wire fortifications meant that anything that made it through the drones would still have to stop and clear obstacles, prolonging exposure. Mines were calibrated for anti-tank purposes, but Ukrainian infantry fighting in the tree lines had RPGs, PKM machine guns, and their own drone teams ready for whatever survived. 2/3 of the motorcycle riders died in the first minutes of the assault. The remaining third scattered in the fields, crouching in shell craters and irrigation ditches, unable to advance and unable to retreat. Communication between the motorcycle wave and the armored formation command collapsed. The radio silence was interpreted as success. The BMP battalion rolled forward, straight into the minefield, straight into the zeroed artillery fire, straight into the drones that had just finished with the motorcycles and were already cycling back to reload. 21 Russian infantry fighting vehicles were destroyed in the space of a few hours. 3 tanks were knocked out. The total count when Ukrainian command compiled the after-action report reached 96 motorcycles destroyed, 21 armored vehicles destroyed, and over 240 Russian soldiers killed or wounded. The assault had failed to gain a single meter of ground. All right, pause. Think about that number for a second. 240 casualties, 96 motorcycles, 21 armored vehicles. In one day, on one stretch of front. Tell me in the comments, did you know this battle even happened? Because almost nobody in the Western media covered it at the scale it deserved. But here is where the story pivots in a way that should disturb every analyst who dismissed the motorcycle doctrine as pure desperation. That same brigade, the 39th, didn't stop. They didn't withdraw. They didn't request different equipment or a different plan. They probed again with small reconnaissance groups, and a few days later, they found it. A weak point in the Ukrainian line near Malinivka, where drone coverage was thinner. A stretch of exposed trench line that Ukrainian forces were rotating in and out under fire, where the defensive rotation timing created a brief window. Russian drones struck the vehicles carrying Ukrainian troops to the position during a rotation cycle. The armored vehicles burned on the road. The trench, for a moment, was undermanned. A small Russian assault group, several teams on motorcycles, crossed the gray zone and seized a segment of the trench before a Ukrainian counterattack could organize. The counterattack itself was struck by drones before it reached the position. Russia had advanced roughly 1 mile. It wasn't a breakthrough, it wasn't blitzkrieg, but it was real, and it mattered, because it meant the motorcycle doctrine could work, under the right conditions, with the right coordination, against the right gap in the right defense at the right moment. Forbes military analyst David Axe, who covered the engagement, noted that exploiting a weak point in the Ukrainian line near Pokrovsk with motorcycle scouts had put the Russians in a position to threaten Pokrovsk's eastern flank for the first time in months. The numbers, he acknowledged, remained brutal for the attackers, but the method was producing results that mass-armored assault under constant drone fire had completely failed to produce for over a year. The Institute for the Study of War, analyzing footage released by the Russian Ministry of Defense in late April 2025 showing motorcycle training exercises, published an assessment that used language rarely deployed in dry analytical writing. The ISW stated that the footage indicated Russia was developing a formal tactical doctrine for systematic offensive motorcycle usage, not a stopgap improvisation, but a doctrine. A repeatable operational template being codified, trained, and industrialized. Russia wanted 120,000 motorcycles, and it was building the training infrastructure to use them. By the summer of 2025, formal motorcycle training had been established at the Novosibirsk Higher Military Command School. The Krasnodar Krai training ground featured dedicated circuit tracks for motorcycles and ATVs, alongside simulation exercises for drone evasion. What had begun as individual unit improvisation under fire was becoming institutional. The Russian military was changing shape, not retreating into an earlier era of warfare, but adapting to the war that actually existed rather than the war it had planned for in 2021. The Ukrainians, watching this transformation, did something remarkable. They copied it. The 425th Separate Assault Regiment announced its first motorcycle assault unit in May 2024 after, as they described it, hundreds of hours of training. The unit's first operational deployment was a nighttime motorcycle incursion into the Kursk region. Ukrainian troops carrying assault rifles and RPGs, riding Chinese and European enduro bikes across the border into Russia. The idea that had made analysts laugh when Russians did it was now being adopted by the side fighting them. Even the British Army had run a trial of the Sur-Ron Firefly electric motorcycle by the Parachute Regiment before the war. The Firefly produced almost no heat signature and almost no sound. Electric motorcycles, already appearing in Ukrainian footage by late 2024, offered something the Chinese gas-powered Enduros could not. Silence. The ability to cross the drone belt without announcing arrival with a roaring engine. The battlefield logic was compressing toward a terrifying endpoint. Both sides were now fielding motorcycle assault units. Both sides were using FPV drones to destroy the other's motorcycle units. The kill ratios were horrific on both sides. The costs, measured in human lives and cheap Chinese machinery, were being absorbed at industrial scale. Russia, by its own procurement projections, planned to field more motorcycle-mounted assault troops than some NATO members have soldiers in their entire ground forces. The Russian soldier from the 39th Guards Motorized Rifle Brigade, who spoke to state media, had described it simply. Our main advantage is that we can drive directly into the enemy position and neutralize everyone. They hear the roar of the motorcycles and it causes panic. They simply abandon their positions and run away. That quote was propaganda. It was also partially true. And that combination, the partial truth wrapped in propaganda, is what made the motorcycle doctrine genuinely dangerous and genuinely worth studying. We are almost at the end, but first, I want to ask you something. What do you think this means for the future of warfare? Motorcycles replacing armored vehicles, drones replacing artillery as the primary killer. Comment below. Tell me your theory. I read every comment. By early 2026, Ukrainian frontline units had developed what their medics were informally calling motorcycle recognition fatigue. The distinctive sound of multiple engines growing louder across an open field at night triggered a conditioned stress response in troops who had spent months in sectors where motorcycle assaults were routine. Commanders reported that veteran soldiers who had withstood artillery bombardments without flinching would grow visibly agitated at the sound of engines approaching from no man's land in the dark. The sound itself had become a psychological weapon. It was not entirely different from what German ground troops in Normandy had described about the sound of P-47 Thunderbolts in 1944. A specific mechanical sound that meant death was inbound, and there was very little time to do anything about it. The difference was that those P-47s could be stopped by retreating inside a building, by an armored roof, by distance. The motorcycle, stripped of its rider the moment it breached the tree line and the rider went to ground with a rifle, became a man-in-a-trench problem. The oldest problem in infantry warfare. And infantry warfare, it turned out, had not been abolished by drones. It had just been made more expensive to reach. The mathematics of the motorcycle doctrine were simultaneously compelling and catastrophic. At 1,500 euros per bike, Russia could lose 100 motorcycles for the cost of a single destroyed BMP. It could absorb 960 motorcycle losses for the price of one T-72 tank. The pilots, the crew, the trained armored infantry inside those vehicles, their deaths were irreplaceable in ways that a conscript on a Chinese Enduro simply was not, at least not according to the cold arithmetic of Russian General Staff planning. The Ukrainian 14th Chervona Kalina Brigades after-action report on the April assault near Pokrovsk included a line that was later quoted by Ukrainian military commentators with grim frequency. They noted that despite the catastrophic losses suffered by the Russian assault force, approximately one-third of the motorcycle riders survived and scattered into forward positions, unable to advance, unable to retreat, stranded in shell craters within hand grenade range of Ukrainian trenches, forced by their proximity to the Ukrainian line into individual close quarters actions with no vehicle support and no resupply. Those men died slowly over the following days in the gray zone between the lines, one by one, because the tactic that had sent them there had never been designed to bring them back. Senior Lieutenant Kovalenko, the drone operator who had watched 150 motorcycles assemble in the dark on the morning of April 17th, filed his after-action statement to Ukrainian military intelligence 2 weeks after the engagement. It was not classified and it was not dramatic. It read with the flat precision of a man who had processed something enormous and decided the only honest response was brevity. They came in knowing they would lose most of them. They sent 150 men on motorcycles into a prepared kill zone with full knowledge that perhaps 50 would survive. The 50 were supposed to clear the path for the armor. The armor came anyway when the 50 didn't report back. I think the planners knew the 50 probably wouldn't make it. I think the 50 knew it too. What I can't explain is why they went. That question, hanging in the gray zone between tactical logic and human cost, was perhaps the most honest summary of what Russia's motorcycle doctrine had actually become. Not a revolution, not a triumph of adaptation, something older and darker, a system that had learned to spend men the way other armies spent ammunition, in volume, on purpose, without apology. And by the spring of 2025, Russia was buying 200,000 motorcycles to keep spending them. The thunder of Chinese engines across Ukrainian fields at 4 a.m. was not the sound of an army that had run out of ideas. It was the sound of an army that had decided human beings, mounted on 1,500 euro machines, were the most cost-effective weapon left in a war that had consumed everything else. Nobody was laughing anymore.